For the final atom number 4, naming the polynomial, we have some more design choices to make. Names are rarely given to polynomials beyond degree 7, the septic. You can go as far as decic comfortably. I think it's undecic if it's of degree 11, but realistically beyond degree 7, usually mathematicians will just say a polynomial of degree whatever. And then in school, you'll rarely see anything beyond a cubic. Maybe a quartic, maybe a quintic at a push if you are at A-level. But this gives us options about how many names we really want to introduce, how much of this actually has value. I would personally, on average, probably err on the side of simplicity and introduce only 3 names. Maybe in total, certainly to start. So I'd go with linear, quadratic and cubic. These might all be new words. And so as with polynomial right at the beginning, I do first want to make sure that all students can actually physically say the word, whether that's a straightforward repeat after me or a need to break it down using form shaping, especially the word quadratic. It then also depends on the particular group of students as to how many you introduce at once. From a certain perspective, it can be ideal to introduce all 3 at once, provided that wouldn't overload students. If it works, it is ideal mainly because it's more efficient, but also because it does give you more variety in the questions you can ask. Instead of just, is this linear, yes or no, you could ask, what name? And students would have to choose between 2 or 3 different possible names. So you could either introduce them all and then give them several expressions to sort between. That's one option. That would be something like this. We give names to some of our... Oh, let me start again. To some polynomials, we give them a name. If it is a polynomial of degree 1, we call it linear. What do we call it? If it is a polynomial of degree 2, we call it quadratic. What do we call it? And if it's a polynomial of degree 3, we call it cubic. What do we call it? Okay, here are 9 expressions. Name each one of them. It's probably not the best way to present it, but if something like that works, it's pretty fast, it's pretty efficient. It does really leave out the we do part of typical instruction. So if you want to introduce a we do, and this is the option I would probably favor, since I do think there's a real risk of losing a lot of kids by just throwing 3 new terms at them at once, then asking them to dive straight into you do. So if we're going for a we do, we probably need to introduce the names one at a time, but it should still be relatively speedy. Again, when you hear me asking questions in a real classroom, there would be a signal for a response. So if I'm going one at a time, it might be, let's get rid of the words for now. We give names to some polynomials. If it is a polynomial of degree 1, we call it linear. What do we call it? Okay. What is the degree of this polynomial? So what do we call it? What is the degree of this polynomial? So what do we call it? Yes, linear. If it is a polynomial of degree 1, we call it linear. If it is a polynomial of degree 2, we call it quadratic. What do we call it? Now, what is the degree of this polynomial? So what do we call it? Okay. What degree? So what do we call it? What degree? What do we call it? What degree? What do we call it? Correct. If it is a polynomial of degree 1, we call it linear. If it's a polynomial of degree 2, we call it quadratic. If it is a polynomial of degree 3, we call it cubic. What do we call it? So, what is the degree of this polynomial? So what do we call it? What degree? What do we call it? What degree? What do we call it? What degree? What do we call it? Okay, here are 9 expressions. Name each one. Okay, I don't know if these were the best possible examples or for the testing sequences that I could have come up with. I came up with those on the fly rather than pre-preparing them. But if there are better ones, and I'm sure there are, that's the general idea. And that took what, maybe a minute? I guess we'll see in the recording. So after a minute-ish, I've introduced linear, quadratic, cubic. Students will have responded to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe 10-ish questions. I'll really have to analyze this after the fact, which means the number of questions per minute, the rate of questions per minute is probably really high as well. Those would all be choral response, so we can move that quickly. And now I want to give them the chance to do a whole bunch of them, which is more I do, just on their own. Then we'll check them together. By the end of all this, if successful, which it certainly should be, pupils will all be able to identify linear polynomials, quadratics, and cubics, which is the majority of my goal. Before getting to quadratic equations, though, I do have one more point around language that I personally treat quite seriously. So I'll get into that next.